Philosophical Transcendentals. What are they? Where do they come from? Why do they matter? This is the Halcyon Project. Let's get into it. The philosophical transcendentals are classically described as goodness, truth, and beauty. And why does that matter in the context of setting up Christian civilizations or parallel societies? Well, I think it's particularly relevant given the fact that every group that claims to be Christian says that the Bible is their rule for faith and practice. But based on the fact that we're all aware of just how many denominations exist in the world, it's very obvious that what the Bible means can be open to a wide variety of interpretations. And despite the fact that everybody thinks their interpretation is correct, somehow we still can't agree. And so there must be something beyond, or something as an adjunct to biblical scripture that can be used for setting up, governing, running, and building a parallel Christian society to preserve the Western traditions that have built effectively the modern world. The philosophical transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty, stem from the Western vein of thought that comes out of Athens. It's commonly said, especially across the right in 2026, that the West is a combination of Athens and Jerusalem. And I wouldn't disagree on the face of it. That's true. I think there is a missing component, and maybe we'll get to that. But essentially what they're getting at when they say that the West is a conglomeration of Jerusalem and Athens is that Jerusalem brings monotheism and morals, or ethics, depending how you want to look at that. And Greece brings philosophy and academia and basically the pursuits of the mind. Goodness, truth, and beauty as philosophical transcendentals come from Plato and were further developed by Aristotle. Now, I am by no means qualified to go into depth on Plato and Aristotle. I'm widely read, but I'm not deeply read when it comes to philosophical concepts. But I think when setting up something like what we're aiming to do with the Halcyon Project, it's worth considering that while unapologetically Christian in our foundations and our convictions, that Christianity, while integral to Western society, is not actually the only component that makes the West the West. There are Christians in China and Africa that are not Western. And so in trying to preserve Western greatness through Christianity and with Christianity, there are other components that are worth considering. And I believe the philosophical transcendentals certainly rank high on that list. Goodness, truth, and beauty are, in Western thought, effectively irreducible concepts. And up until relatively recently, historically speaking, they were taken as a given. Up until postmodern deconstruction, nobody questioned the fact that goodness or truth or beauty was a thing, or that it was objective. And so, for my money, I think we need to go back to that, where, okay, the postmodern thinkers, they bring up some interesting ideas when it comes to textual criticism and deconstructing certain ideas, but sometimes there's some things that just don't need to be deconstructed. If we're honest with ourselves, unless you've thought yourself completely stupid, everybody knows there's such a thing as goodness because everybody knows there's such a thing as evil. Everybody knows there's such a thing as truth because everybody knows there's such a thing as a lie, despite what people in media and culture today might tell you. Beauty is a bit of an interesting one because it seems that on the surface, even the most conservative of the right wing in modern discourse questions whether beauty is objective or exists as its own thing. I would certainly argue that it does. And I think that can be borne out by the fact that if you look at a Gothic cathedral next to a brutalist skyscraper, you know, even if you can't explain or express why, that one of those things is objectively more beautiful than the other. The mechanics of that and what counts as beautiful, that's a different discussion that's beyond the scope of this particular talk. Maybe we'll go there at some point in the future. And that's not to say that other cultures don't make things objectively beautiful, even though they don't look like classical Western architecture or art. But there are certain things that are objective across cultures and across time that people, human beings, acknowledge as objectively beautiful. And so we need, as a group, as people who, let's say those of us fighting to make normal, we need to start treating these things as self-evident, because if you listen to conscience, they clearly are self-evident. And so when we're trying to set up parallel societies or Christian societies that function within a postmodern world, in our own discussions and the way we think, we need to start treating these things as if they objectively exist, and then as an extending them as something that's worth pursuing. Now, at some far-flung future point, if there is some kind of parallel society set up based on Christian Western values, I think that needs to go beyond simply using the Bible as a guide. Not to say that it's not a guide, but these transcendentals, these philosophical transcendentals, need to be highly considered at the same time. And part of the reason for that is the Protestant iconoclasm that exists clearly in the West, where I'll say that I'm a bit of an iconoclast at heart, that can certainly be taken too far, where you go through any city in North America and everything is nothing but gray cubes, where you go through old cities in Europe where they haven't been taken over, and you look at old churches and you look at old housing complexes from the early 1800s or before, and you see something that is objectively superior from an aesthetic sense. That doesn't come from chapter and verse exactly. It certainly emanates from a certain understanding of Scripture, but it's also tempered with this idea, Jerusalem meeting Athens, where Athens had these ideas of these transcendentals, and Western civilization applied those transcendentals almost universally until, well, arbitrarily, let's just say the French Revolution. And it produced a society that was completely upward oriented, or at least the artifacts that it left behind were upward oriented. When you step into a cathedral built in the 1500s, you find yourself standing up straighter and staring up at the ceiling. And that's because the concepts of these philosophical transcendentals are built into the structure itself, and it causes you to be better. And when that kind of thinking is applied to every aspect of life, be it civic, religious, business, if it's done across the culture, you end up with a society that calls people to be better implicitly, not even explicitly. And so if goodness, truth, and beauty are a guiding star in the administration and living out of a Christian society, the society itself, without being preachy and without having to beat somebody over the head, will cause people to be better. You will cause them to be good. You will cause them to seek and see truth, and you will cause them to build beautifully. Obviously, at the beginning, recovering from this postmodern stupor that we've all been in for 150 plus years, this does have to be explicit. But by the third or fourth generation, it's completely implicit, and it isn't something that even has to be explained. And for my money, I think if you take goodness, truth, and beauty as a triad, and you pursue those three honestly and with integrity, effectively what you end up doing is pursuing God and the kingdom of heaven. If you build civic structures and hierarchies of management and rulership based on goodness, truth, and beauty, you're effectively building the kingdom of heaven on earth. If you pursue goodness, truth, and beauty in your own life and you meditate on it, you are effectively making yourself as godly as you can. You are orienting yourself to the highest thing when those things are taken as a triad. And if you get more granular, I suppose goodness, truth, and beauty on their own are quite one-dimensional. They're not exactly one-dimensional, but taken on their own, it's pretty easy on the face of it to understand what's being talked about. But when you take them as a dyad, I think something interesting actually happens. When you take goodness, truth, and beauty and you break them off into pairs, I think something interesting happens. And that is to say, if you as an individual commit your life's work to pursuing goodness and truth, if you did that as in complete ignorance, without any kind of cultural baggage, which we can't do, but just as a thought experiment, I think if you did that, inevitably, you might not get to the level of advancement we're at today, but I think inevitably what you come to, if you pursue goodness and truth honestly and sincerely, is you basically will come to the idea of science or the scientific method. Because if you pursue truth and goodness, if you pursue the goodness of truth and the truth in goodness, you basically will be compelled to understand the world around you, what's true and what isn't, and what goodness that brings out. And effectively, that is an undefiled, unpoliticized, and unreligiousized, let's say, science. Not scientism, but you're seeking to understand the world and what's in it, and what goodness that can teach you, which is basically an undefiled form of science. If you take goodness and beauty as a dyad and you pursue that, again, in a vacuum, not knowing anything, if you just pursued that in good faith, sincerely, you would come effectively to art. And I say art as a kind of a broad word, anything visual or written that pursues goodness and is beautiful is art. And that's not to say that the art that a society like this would make has to be fluffy, feel good, because some of the most beautiful pieces of art in Western history are actually grotesque. In fact, if you even look at Gothic cathedrals and you see the gargoyles on the outside, the ugliness is part of the beauty, much like perfumers will add a rancid note to a fragrance to balance out the sweet sense that they have in that fragrance. The rancid note actually balances the scent and makes it better overall. So that's not to say it's this fluffy, saccharine, overly sweet thing, but if you pursue beauty, and through beauty goodness, and through goodness beauty, you will inevitably land on pursuing art. Truth and beauty, I think, is maybe the most interesting, because they're two things that maybe have the least in common with each other, at least to my mind on the face of it. But I think when you pursue truth, and you pursue beauty through truth, and you pursue truth through beauty, actually, what you come to, and I think this is where the Greeks landed, is you basically come up with philosophy. And obviously, philosophy can be misused, it can be misguided, and it can be pointed in the wrong direction. Just look at postmodernism for examples of that, or any of the schools of thought that led to the French Revolution. But when truth is sought through beauty, honestly and with integrity, and beauty through truth, essentially you do come up with a form of undefiled philosophy. And when you take undefiled forms of philosophy and art and science and you take them together, it can't point you anywhere other than at God. Now, maybe that doesn't get you to the Christian God exactly, but I think inevitably if you're pointed at God, capital G, you're pointed at the same place as the Christian theologians are. You might not know it, it might not be explicit, but that certainly is the end point. And if you pursue those three things, either goodness, truth, and beauty taken on their own, or in sets of two as dyads in science, art, and philosophy, you end up at the transcendent. You end up at the divine. And so if you apply that as a concept to the administration and the building of society and civic structures, moving into a world where Christians have to build something other than the postmodern system, I think you end up with a society that is both more human and more divine, and in being divine is more human, and in being human is more divine. That might sound heretical to some, but I'm not terribly worried about that, at least not right now. So taken together, if we remarry Athens to Jerusalem, I think you come back with a much more balanced way of building back from the ashes that postmodernism has left in its wake. And I mean, it's not just postmodernism, but for the purposes of this conversation, I think that works as a pretty accurate catch-all. And so, for my money, with the Halcyon Project, I think the three guiding principles, besides being unapologetically Christian, in order to preserve the West, we need to go back seriously to the pursuit of objective goodness, objective truth, and objective beauty, and stop apologizing for the fact that we are pursuing those things. Anybody who says there's no such thing as objective goodness, truth, or beauty, frankly, is in the wrong place, and I really don't want to have much to do with them, to be honest. And so I think that's maybe a good place to leave it for now, probably some good food for thought. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that in the comments section below. Leave your comments and feedback, and we'll see if we can start a conversation. And so with that, we'll catch you on the next one.